MacVoices is supported by LinkedIn Jobs. Find the right person for your business today with LinkedIn Jobs. Pay what you want and get $50 off your first job post at linkedin.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, this time around we get to talk to another Take Control author, one that we haven't talked to for a little while, about a new book, but this is very, very different. We're going to first introduce Michael Cohen. Michael's been here before. Michael, it's great to see you. Thanks for being back.
Good to see you too, Chuck.
So this book is quite a bit different. It is Apple Interface Mysteries, not Take Control of Apple Interface Mysteries, but just Apple Interface Mysteries. But it is a Take Control book. And so that begs the very first question of why is it not Take Control of Apple Interface Mysteries?
Because I don't tell you how to take control of them. You have no control over them, really. You get what they give you. That's partly it. But also, most Take Control books, literally almost all of them, are about how to get something done, how to do something, how to use an application, how to perform a process or a workflow or something. It's about the hows. And this book is more about the whys. So it's not your typical, if you read this book, you'll know how to do X, Y, and Z. It's more like if you do this book, you'll know why things are as messed up or confusing as you always suspected they were.
Now, that kind of flies in the face of the idea that I think a lot of us have, and that a lot of us espouse, that Apple's interface makes a lot of sense once you understand it.
Yeah, it does. And there are historical and cultural and commercial and stylistic reasons why it isn't.
Why it isn't what?
Why it isn't as intuitive and easy to use as you thought and as legend has it. It's not that it's any harder to use than anything else. Most Apple stuff is easier than competitors' products in a lot of ways. But that doesn't mean they're not complicated. That doesn't mean they're not full of weird little tricks you have to know to get them to do what you want them to do. They're easy to use if you know how to do it. Seems to be part of the problem. This all started actually because a little over a year ago, Joe Kissel, who runs Take Control, and I were talking about the fact that he doesn't want to do many more gigando books like my Take Control of Pages, which is probably longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey at this point, that have to be updated all the time. And he said he was looking for a short standard book that wouldn't require much updating. And I said, well, I've always wanted to write something about user interface design. And I said, I could probably do that in about 70 pages. Turns out to be more like 170, and turns out to have taken more than a couple of months to write this thing. It took almost a year because there was a lot of time when I'm just sitting there thinking, what do I really think about this? And that, and the other topic. So it just kept going on and on. So that's how the book came to be.
Okay, so we'll just get this out of the way, and then I want to get into some specific examples that you cover in the book. But this has been, I think, an issue going along. I mean, for personal computers in general, for operating systems in particular, that we all are looking for more features, new features, and useful features. Like, why can't I set the window space to be this standard, or why can't I set the system font to be that? Those are options. And so if I want control over them, it has to be an option. And yet that adds to the complexity of the interface and of learning the interface, even though I might never really, honest to God, need to change the font, or I might never really need to change the standard window size. But some people do, some people want it, and therefore it becomes an option/complexity.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly how a lot of this stuff happens. Sometimes it happens because, a development team looks over at a competitor and says, oh, they've got this feature that got some press. We should add that feature too, even though we've never heard a peep out of our users saying that they wanted it. It becomes a marketing thing. That's another thing. Or it may be, as with iOS 6 to 7, where the world was going towards a flatter look for interfaces, and suddenly iOS had to be de-skeuomorphed. Do you remember the great de-skeuomorphication of iOS?
Sure.
Where suddenly all the buttons were no longer 3D or even looked like buttons. That wasn't a functional choice. It was a stylistic and a marketing choice as much as anything else. And, it caused a lot of consternation among people who didn't want anything to change, and made a lot of people happy because, they got bored with the way things looked and any change was good. So there's all sorts of reasons to change stuff that has nothing to do with functionality. And that mixes in too.
Yeah, and we were having a discussion pre-show about a particular application or a particular set of applications that we won't name, and our frustration with the user interface design of those applications. And I know I work with some corporate systems that just make me crazy, because it's like, who designed this thing? It's about as counterintuitive as you can make it. It's not flexible. It's not customizable. And yet somebody bought it.
Well, yeah.
Okay, moving on.
I've been working on developing and designing user interfaces for most of my professional career, and that goes back to the late 70s. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the very first programming job I did was writing stuff in a combination of assembly language and Fortran 4, user interfaces for testing systems of the telemetry processing assembly of the Deep Space Network. So I had a very small audience, the few engineers who had to run the tests. But I had to write the code not to actually test the equipment, but to give them an interface for running this test and acquiring results, sets of commands and like that. That was my very first job, was designing and implementing user interfaces. And I've been kind of doing that for most of my professional career with computers, really. And it's an act of communication as much as it is an act of algorithms and processes. Functionality is useless if it can't be exposed to the user. And the user has to be able to understand what that functionality is and how to engage with it in a way that makes sense to a human being. I mean, you could have a command line where everything you type is a command. You say, run, and then you give a list of options, and that's the way things used to be. There are other ways to do the same thing, though. Lots of ways to do the same thing. And that's what happened when Apple came out with stuff following their look at the stuff that Xerox PARC was doing, where they changed the complete paradigm of what a user interface was. It was used to be verb and then nouns, run, program, delete, file. In the Mac world and at the Xerox PARC world, they turned the syntax around. It was noun verb. This window, close it. That file, open it. So you start with the noun, then you go to the command. So you chose what you wanted to work on first, then you chose a command to do something with it. And that's why we had menus. Because then you didn't have to remember all the commands because they were on a menu.
I'm going to take the last minute and a half or so that you've discussed there and send that to some people, because I think they desperately need to understand this, that, you're right. It's useless if you can't figure it out. And if we're right back to the old thing of, Mac users don't like to read manuals. Well, we really, for the longest time, we didn't need to read manuals, because it was, once you learned the very basics, you could pretty much figure anything out, and it wasn't very hard. Now, admittedly, it's gotten a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, it's gotten a lot more complex because we as users have become more sophisticated and are looking for those extra features or those extra capabilities.
We want our stuff to do so much more. I mean, it was a godsend, to be able to type something in backspace to delete it back in the day. I mean, that was big juju. That was real magic. But now you want to change the font and link it to something else and launch another program from it, and maybe make the text dance if you mouse over it. I mean, there's all sorts of things you could do with text. And people have done with text, other than just type it and edit it. And you start stuff like that falls into Microsoft Word, and you'll see features like that, and Pages has just come out with a revision that now lets you do drop caps easily. Nobody ever wanted to do a drop cap in a student paper, or something like that. But now we're doing, Gutenberg's Bible in Pages, and we want to have drop caps, ornate drop caps. So you then have to have a formatting command for that. And if you want to vary the look, you have to add options to that command. So does it drop this far down, that far down? How much offset from the drop cap to the rest of the text is there? Do you want to color it? And on and on and on. All of that stuff because you want to have a drop cap.
Right. And I mean, if you're authoring for a print publication, maybe say a magazine or something, then, maybe drop caps are something that, will add some je ne sais quoi to the page. That's great. But you're right. Those are options. And I know if I go into certain programs and I'm looking to do something specific and I don't have an option to control that, I'm borderline annoyed. I'll find a way to work around it. But no, it would be nice if I could just tweak this a little bit. And, that means that would be one more level or piece of complexity to that program.
And for anybody who doesn't need that functionality, they go into the program, they see this command and go, why is this on my screen? Do I have to worry about it?
Right. Exactly. That's well said. Yes. Well, so that's a nice little introduction to, I think, thinking about interfaces. And I don't think a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about those things. But so give us some examples of what this book is, since it's so different from a normal Take Control book.
Well, it starts off with a very short chapter about a theoretical matter, what usability is, what the whole art, craft, subject of usability is in design. Because there is one, and there's a huge amount written about and discussed about how to develop user interfaces. And there's terms of art, things like affordances, discoverability. And so I give a very brief introduction to usability itself and what concerns people who design user interfaces, the things they think about. And I connect it to language because it's an act of communication. And we've been doing this for thousands of years. Before we had computers, we had something called rhetoric, which was a whole field of study to tell you how best to communicate to the masses, to your friends, what have you. And they had lists of things you can do with words, ways you can arrange them to make them more effective. User interface is a lot the same. There's now bunches of interface patterns that designers can go to. Do we want to have commands along the left side with buttons? Do we want to have drop-down menus? Do we want to have menus that pop up only when you mouse over them? There are all sorts of different techniques now, and rules or advice or tendencies to do things one way or the other. Very, very similar to what ancient rhetoricians did when they were talking about public addresses. It's something humans have always done, found ways to optimize their communications with each other.
Okay.
Or sometimes found ways to optimize how they lie to each other.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're not going to get into that.
Believe it or not, your computer is doing a lot of that lying too. It's disguising a lot of inherent complexity under the guise of simplicity, which is a huge lie. Do you actually know how hard it is to turn a key press on a keyboard into a well-defined letter on the screen? A whole lot is going on than just, a key hitting a ribbon, tapping on a piece of paper like we used to do. There's a ton of coding that goes on to make that happen, and a ton more to make it seem so transparent you don't know all of that is going on.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that's lying. I mean, I think
it's concealing the reality behind. It's a lie in the sense it makes you assume that this is really not hard. And in fact, it's incredibly hard to make things work well. And when it works really well, you don't realize how hard it was to get it to work that way.
Okay.
It's in a sense, it's a fiction. When you look at an ice dancer who does some beautiful work on the ice, and it seems so effortless, you have no idea how much work is behind that.
Yeah, I've used that example all the time. The downhill skier, that is going at breakneck speeds, and yet they make it look easy. The ice dancer, name a professional athlete, and 98% of them make it look easy. And the hours and hours and hours that went into developing those skills, are people aren't willing to pay that price. And so it's good here that somebody has paid that price, so that when I hit a key, the appropriate letter appears on the screen.
And yet that fiction, that lovely fiction that it's all so simple, has its downside, because people expect things to be simple that in fact are very hard. Why can't somebody make it work this way instead of that way? And it seems to people who are complaining, it would be just so easy to do it, until you set out to do it.
LinkedIn Jobs is supporting MacVoices. You know what makes your business go and grow? Good people. Good salespeople, good service people, good design people, good marketing people. Pick a function at your company, and it's the people behind it that make it great. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs is so important. LinkedIn Jobs not only helps you find the right people, but it helps you find them easily. That's important since you have one or two other things to do during the day. I'm on LinkedIn. You're on LinkedIn. Or you should be. If someone in business isn't on LinkedIn, I tend to ask why, and then I go to the next person who is. That's because I know that the candidates on LinkedIn are screened for hard and soft skills to make the hire not just fast, but right. There's a reason that LinkedIn Jobs is rated the #1 hiring platform for delivering quality hires. And that same reason is why someone is hired every 8 seconds with LinkedIn. Tap into that power as you make your next hire. Find the right person for your business today with LinkedIn Jobs. You can pay what you want and get the first $50 off. Just visit linkedin.com/MacVoices. Again, that's linkedin.com/MacVoices to get $50 off your first job post. Terms and conditions apply. Thanks to LinkedIn Jobs for their support of MacVoices. Well, so what are some of the things in the Apple interface that you consider mysterious?
Oh gosh, there's scores of them. The book actually breaks down into 3 big sections, about the Mac, about iOS, and then some things you can do to work with it. In the Mac, I break it down into how menus got complicated, how keyboards got complicated, how the mouse and trackpads got complicated, and how the desktop and window management got complicated. So I could go from any one of them. Some of the mysteries. If I just accidentally move my mouse to the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you go away, because that is to be a hot point, a hot corner on my screen to do expose, which clears the desktop so I can see stuff behind it. But if I forgot I set that hot corner and I'm just working and suddenly everything goes away, I'm going, what the heck? Or if I'm at someone else's machine and they set the hot corner and I didn't know about it, I'm thinking I broke their machine. That's a simple mystery. Here's one. It's something that we all know how to do. We didn't even think it was mysterious until you looked at it. You have a list of files in the Finder, an alphabetical list, let's say, and you want to select a subset of that list. There's nothing in the interface that tells you really how to do it. You click at the first item, hold down the shift, click at the last item, and everything in between gets selected. How did you learn that? Is there anything in the interface that tells you about shift clicking? Yet that's a standard Apple Macintosh rhetorical gesture, if you will, that goes back almost to the beginning. Or command clicking that lets you select disparate things in a list. It's not discoverable. It's not obvious. It's something that exists, but you'd never know it until somebody tells you. You can't figure it out from first principles.
How can I disagree with that? Because you're right. It's obvious, but Is that? Oh boy, is that a feature that? I mean, first of all,
it was a feature added as a convenience because the original way of selecting things was to click at the top, slide down, and let up the mouse at the bottom. And that's fine, but that meant you're lifting your fingers off the keyboard all the time and you're manipulating the mouse. So some people say, well, let's come up with an easier way to do this. And then they added on more to that and more to that, and then became a little more complicated. Now you can option click and drag, and that does something different than just a straight drag in the Finder, because that was a shortcut way of doing things. Often a lot of these things pop up because the original, very simple, I hate to use the word intuitive because intuitive doesn't really mean it, a very simple and easily discoverable interface that Apple had in 1984 makes you do a lot more work if you only stick within those rigid rules of what they let you do.
So for some reason, I feel like I'm being defensive here. Okay, don't quite know why, but maybe I am. And you're right. I mean, this has been one of the arguments, and I think you just said, this is a shortcut, not the iOS version shortcut thing, but it's a shortcut to accomplish something a little bit easier. And so it's not exactly a detriment.
There's no problem with it.
Yeah, I mean,
this is not a problem, but it is a mystery. It's a mystery because you don't know it exists until somebody gives you the clue to solve it.
Okay, all right.
There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff in the interface like that. Pop-up menus. How do you know if something is a pop-up menu? It used to be pretty simple. You'd have something that looked like a menu button on the screen with a down arrow. Every time you saw one of those, it was a pop-up menu. Simple. You didn't have to go to the menu bar. You could have menus right inside of Windows. That solved certain problems, made things easier to do. People could figure them out. That's great. Then the web came about. And web designers, with a whole bunch of toolboxes of new things that they could do and try, came up with different approaches to do the same thing. And so that migrated back into the Apple interface. And so now you have pop-up menus that have that down-pointing arrow, or maybe a little tiny down-pointing arrow, or maybe it looks like a gear, or maybe it doesn't look like anything at all until you mouse over it and then it appears. All of these things happen for a variety of reasons, partly because somebody at Apple saw it happen somewhere else and realized that that web page was getting a lot of hits or people liked the way it worked. They said, let's try it on one of our products, and now migrated in as well. But now you look at an interface that Apple puts out or a third-party developer puts out, and you'll have pop-up menus on the interface, but you won't know they're menus until you click on them.
You're right. You're right. So does that, in your opinion, does that mean that Apple's human interface guidelines have been degraded to the point that they're meaningless, or just?
No, they're not meaningless, but they have changed and mutated over time. They're not strictly held to. And as guidelines change when behavior changes, when user communities change, when user expectations change. For a long time, Apple had a very solid, consistent Mac fan base. Then they came out with the iPod. And suddenly a lot of Apple people, non-Apple people, were buying Apple equipment and then moving on to the Mac. And they're coming in with different expectations about how computers work. And so Apple's got to serve their needs as well. Then you have the iPhone and iOS coming out, which have a whole new paradigm for how you interact with things. And you're bringing people into the Apple ecosphere that had never been there before, coming in with new expectations. And so the push to make macOS a little bit more like iOS is partly to make them feel more at home on their computers.
Okay, that's so. I'm starting to understand now. I mean, this isn't, a lot of this stuff is evolutionary. So
the book there's a huge amount of history in this book. It's literally how the desktop got complicated, how the mouse got complicated. Because every time you introduced a level of functionality, people would say, great, but what if I could also do this? And then stuff gets added on and added on. and then it comes to be expected. And soon, from a very, very simple user interface paradigm of 1984, you have today's macOS Catalina, which has all sorts of places on the screen and all sorts of things you can do with your pointers and all sorts of things you can do with the windows that the first Mac users never imagined. They weren't possible. They weren't even considered. There was no internet back in 1984 for them to play on, really.
Right.
Well, there was one, but very few people played on it.
Yeah.
And most of them were at Stanford, UCLA, Berkeley, MIT.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is interesting, and of course, we haven't even, and I doubt that you touch on in the book, the capabilities that a lot of third-party enhancements introduce.
I mentioned them a little bit, yeah, but I primarily look at stuff that's kind of sort of standard for Apple software and hardware that other people are using and building off of. And here's the other thing. Apple also provides their developers with a user interface toolkit or toolkits. Tons and tons of special graphic symbols now that you can use in the iOS interface to label buttons that they didn't have in the very early days. They evolved until now with iOS 13. You've got them. You've got, hundreds of characters for the share button, the reply button, all the other things. Stuff that just grew up and evolved at need. It's the way that languages evolve. You don't need a word for butterflies if you don't have any butterflies around until you see one. Then you got to come up with a name for it. Languages evolve because environments change, human needs change, human activities change, and evolve. It happens on computers too, because it's just part of the human communicative requirement. We all want to talk to each other. We all want to talk to our machines.
So the word, but from both of us, we both keep coming up with evolution. So yes. I have the impression that these aren't necessarily slamming Apple for the anything. It's just this is how it evolved. And you're right. I mean, think back to the original Mac and what they could do with it. And that was so revolutionary at the time. And now it's borderline. It goes beyond simplistic as to the way the interface was. And yet we still use the basic elements of that interface now. It's just evolved to such a much more sophisticated degree.
I think of the Scotty character in Star Trek IV who picks up the Mac and looks at it and goes, "How quaint."
That's a really good example. Because even if you and I go and watch that movie again and watch Scotty, pick up the mouse and go and the keyboard and go for it, it does kind of look sort of quaint by our standards now. So I'm not sure we have gotten to the point where Scotty was, but at the same time, we've moved past that, and it is kind of quaint.
And there's something else that factors into it too, and this is a relatively recent phenomenon, which makes your machines even more mysterious. And that has to do with artificial intelligence, machine intelligence. And, we want our machines to respond to verbal commands, or to understand what we're typing so that it'll fix it for us, and so we have autocorrect. But artificial intelligence, unlike what we usually expect from computers, which is complete repeatability. If you do something this way this time, the next time you do it will be exactly the same way because it's a state machine. It's predetermined. It's programmed. It's ones and zeros. Well, AI at its bottom still works with ones and zeros and deterministic systems, but it works off of probabilities. So if you give a command to Siri today, and maybe you give the same command tomorrow, there may be a slightly different interpretation because other stuff has gone on in the meantime to change the information available to the Siri mechanisms that are evaluating everything you say. Maybe that frog in your throat changed your pronunciation just enough so it heard a different word than the word it heard yesterday. People make mistakes listening to each other all the time. Why shouldn't Siri? Why shouldn't Alexa? Why shouldn't Cortana make mistakes? They're only human.
This is a great discussion, and it makes me all the more excited about the book, because when I first heard about the book and heard the concept, I thought, gee, this is not quite the take control way to be picking on Apple or slamming Apple, just in a whole book. And that's not what this isn't. That's not what this is. This is an explanation of how we got to where we are.
Yeah.
And also, what you just said about Siri and the other I was about to say people. That's not good. The other entities. No, that's not good either. Assistants. Let's try that. The other assistants.
Well, look, everything on a computer is a metaphor, so you can pretend they're people. That's just fine.
I don't know. Then people think I'm even stranger than I am. But no, you're right. We need to look through this at the eyes through what really is trying to be accomplished. And, some of it really should be still considered kind of miraculous, and others, but there's still a long way to go. Going back to Scotty in the movie. Yeah, it's, that's how, where will we be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Like, I think when the first iPhone came out, it didn't look, the interface was not at all like what we see now, other than the icons. But
yes, and I talk about that a little bit about as it developed capability, stuff got layered on and got layered on and got layered on. The very first iPhone couldn't do cut, copy, and paste. iPhone version 2 couldn't do cut, copy, and paste. It took till version 3 that Apple came up with a finger smart way of selecting, copying, and cutting text that worked well enough that people could use it. And they waited that long because they didn't want to tie themselves to a interface paradigm that was limited. So they had to get it right because it would be fundamental going forward. But they couldn't get it right on the first iPhone because they didn't have enough people using it to really find out what would be right. You actually had to watch how people interacted with it and draw a few clues. User interface design is partly art, like writing. It's partly psychology, like seeing what people do. That's audience research if you're in marketing. I mean, it's all of these things. You have to have an understanding of people and an understanding about what's possible technically, and understanding about cultural expectations, which can vary. If you design a user interface, it doesn't take into account the fact that there's some people in the world who have long fingernails and won't find fingertip controls especially working for them. If you don't design around that, you've got problems. You have to understand your audience. Your audience is just one other person, and it's certainly not the engineer sitting in the cubicle next to you, which unfortunately is how all too many user interface decisions get made originally. Hey, Phil, how does this look? It works for me. Good, ship it.
We'll be back with the second part of our discussion with Michael E. Cohen about his new book, Apple Interface Mysteries from Take Control Books. In the next section, Michael and I get into a few more specifics about some of the Apple interface, not mysteries, well, that's his term, but the characteristics and how they have evolved and how iOS has evolved and kind of how we got to where we are and why. And I think for me, it's a really, really interesting discussion. I hope it will be for you. So with that, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Voices. I hope to see you back here next time. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you Mac Voices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.